In 1930, one man picked up a handful of salt and shook the British Empire. But this story didn't begin in India. It began thousands of years earlier.
To understand why, you have to go back, further than Rome, further than Egypt. Back to a time before refrigeration, before chemistry, before the long chain of technologies we use to keep food from rotting. Back to a world where summer's abundance could not survive into winter unless you had something to stop the decay. Back to a world that desperately, urgently, existentially needed salt, and had almost none. The human body requires sodium to survive. This is not optional. Sodium regulates every fluid in your body: blood pressure, nerve signaling, muscle contraction, the basic electrochemical processes that keep your heart beating and your brain firing. Without it, you die. Not eventually. Quickly. For most of human prehistory, our ancestors obtained sodium the same way other animals did, through meat. The blood and organs of hunted animals contain enough sodium to meet the body's basic needs, and for hunter-gatherers living primarily on protein, salt as a separate substance was largely unnecessary. It was only when humans began the transition to agriculture, when grain and vegetables replaced meat as the caloric foundation of the diet, that the sodium deficit became acute. Plants contain very little sodium. A diet built on wheat, barley, lentils, and vegetables will leave the body chronically salt-depleted unless sodium is obtained from somewhere else. And the somewhere else, for the first farmers of the ancient world, was a substance they had to find, mine, transport, and trade across enormous distances. The moment humanity planted its first seed, it created its first salt problem, and solving that problem would define the next 10,000 years. Origins and discovery: no one discovered salt. It discovered us. Salt is among the most widely distributed minerals on Earth. It crystallizes on coastlines wherever seawater evaporates. It forms thick underground deposits in regions where ancient seas once lay. Deposits that, millions of years later, human miners would chase downward into the earth in search of the white seams. It rises to the surface in salt springs and seeps into lakes, leaving the shorelines white with mineral crust. Wherever humans settled, near coasts, near salt springs, near ancient lake beds, they encountered it. They tasted it. They noticed in time something remarkable. Food that touched salt did not rot as quickly. Meat packed in salt could survive days, then weeks, then months. Fish treated with brine could travel inland, arriving edible at destinations weeks' journey from the sea. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous to a world that had no framework for understanding microbiology. No concept of bacteria or osmosis or the cellular mechanisms by which salt draws moisture from tissue and creates an environment hostile to the microorganisms that cause decay. What they knew was simpler and more powerful. Salt kept food alive. And in a world where starvation was always one bad harvest away, that knowledge was worth everything. The earliest known salt production sites discovered by archaeologists date to several thousand years ago. In Romania, at a site called Lunca in the Moldova region, evidence of systematic salt production, ceramic vessels used for boiling brine, associated with a Neolithic settlement, has been dated to possibly as early as 6000 BC, though archaeologists continue to refine these estimates. In China, archaeological evidence from the Shanxi province suggests salt harvesting from Yuncheng Salt Lake as far back as 6,000 years ago. These are not isolated discoveries. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, the moment human settlements reached a certain scale of agriculture, the archaeological record shows the emergence of salt production. This was not coincidence, this was necessity made visible in the ground. But producing salt locally was rarely sufficient. The geography of salt deposits is uneven, capricious, indifferent to where people happen to live. Vast agricultural heartlands, the Ganges Plain in India, the interior of West Africa, the farming villages of medieval France, had no local salt whatsoever. The people who lived there needed salt just as desperately as everyone else. And the people who happened to live near salt deposits understood, with a clarity that required no formal education in economics, exactly what that need was worth. Salt became the first great commodity of long-distance trade. Before iron, before textiles, before spices, before silk, salt was moving across enormous distances, carried by human hands and animal backs along routes that would eventually become the roads of civilization itself. Here's the question worth sitting with. What does it mean that the first thing humans traded across distances, the first thing that created the economic foundation for trade routes, for markets, for the concept of merchant and customer and price, was not a luxury, not a jewel, not a decoration, but a biological necessity? What does it say about the nature of value and wealth and the human condition, that the thing which made civilization possible was not gold but a mineral without which life itself cannot continue? The answer, as we will see, is everything. Salt and the birth of civilization. No civilization understood the power of salt earlier or exploited it more completely than ancient Egypt. The Nile Valley was one of the most productive agricultural environments the ancient world would ever know. But that productivity, the grain, the vegetables, the fish from the river, and the Mediterranean coast, would have been useless without the ability to store and preserve it. Egypt's military campaigns, its construction projects, its administrative apparatus all depended on feeding large numbers of people far from the fields where food was grown. Salt made this possible. Egyptian preservers had access to a particular form of sodium carbonate found in dry lake beds along the western delta, a mineral they called natron. Natron was not table salt, but it behaved in similar ways. It desiccated tissue, drew out moisture, created an environment in which organic matter could not easily decompose. Egyptian embalmers used natron to preserve the bodies of their dead for eternity. And Egyptian fish curers used the same mineral, alongside ordinary sea salt from the Mediterranean coast, to preserve the catch of the Nile for distribution across the empire. The salted fish of Egypt was a commodity of genuine imperial significance. Papyri from various periods record saltfish, called pterikos, in the Greek records of the later Ptolemaic period, being produced in industrial quantities, taxed by the state, traded across the Mediterranean, and consumed as a staple protein by everyone from pyramid workers to palace guards. When Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes for the multitude in the Gospel account, the fish in question were almost certainly salted. Preserved fish was the only affordable protein available to the poor of the ancient Near East. Salt was not merely useful in ancient Egypt, it was foundational. It was the difference between an empire that could project power across distance and a collection of villages that could barely feed themselves through winter. And Egypt was not alone in this understanding. Across the ancient world, the civilizations that mastered salt production and distribution were the civilizations that grew to dominate their regions. The relationship was not accidental, it was causal. In ancient China, the salt lakes of Shanxi, particularly Yuncheng, also called the Heidong Salt Pool, were recognized as a strategic resource of extraordinary importance as early as the Xia dynasty, traditionally dated to the 3rd millennium BC. Chinese historical texts describe battles fought specifically for control of the Heidong Pool, battles in which the fate of entire dynasties was determined by who could claim the white mineral of that ancient lake. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, one of the mythological founding figures of Chinese civilization, is associated in legend with the control of salt production. In China, the connection between salt and state power was not a later development. It was present at the very origin of civilization. In Mesoamerica, the salt lakes and coastal evaporation pans of the Yucatan were controlled and distributed through networks that archaeologists are still mapping. The Maya traded salt across their entire civilization area. Salt deposits in the Guerrero region of modern Mexico were exploited by Aztec networks centuries before European contact. On the other side of the world, across the vast interior of sub-Saharan Africa, entire trading systems were organized around the movement of salt southward from the desert deposits of the Sahara to the agricultural societies of the savanna and forest zones, who had grain and gold but desperately needed what the desert held. Everywhere humans built cities, they built them around access to salt. And where the salt had to come from far away, they built roads to bring it closer. The mineral that built empires. Rome built an empire on many foundations: military discipline, engineering, law, political organization. But before any of those, at the very beginning of Rome's rise from village to city-state to world power, there was salt. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, is one of the oldest roads in Italy, predating the Roman Republic itself. It ran from the salt marshes at the mouth of the Tiber River and later extended eastward to the Adriatic coast, where large salt flats near the modern city of Servia produced salt in quantities sufficient to supply not just Rome but the broader Italian peninsula. This road did not merely carry salt. It was built because of salt. The imperative to move this substance reliably and at scale from its source to the population centers that needed it drove one of the earliest examples of large-scale infrastructure investment in Western history. Consider what salt meant to the individual Roman legionary, not the general, not the emperor, but the ordinary foot soldier marching through the dust of an Italian summer. He carried perhaps 30 kilograms of equipment. He marched 20 miles a day. In that heat, in that labor, his body lost salt through sweat at a rate that, if not replenished, would lead first to muscle cramps, then to confusion, then to collapse. The Roman military understood this, not in biochemical terms, but in absolutely practical ones. Soldiers who ran out of salt stopped fighting effectively. Salt was therefore not a comfort or a reward. It was a military supply line requirement, as fundamental as weapons or sandals. And the Roman state treated it accordingly. The Romans were extraordinarily clear-eyed about salt's strategic importance. The state controlled salt production and distribution with the same seriousness it applied to military supply. Salt prices were regulated, and salt became so embedded in the Roman economy that it left a permanent mark on the English language itself. Our word salary derives from the Latin salarium, a term associated with salt allowances and payments in the Roman world. Historians debate exactly how salt figured into soldier compensation. It may have been a cash allowance for purchasing salt, or a reflection of salt's role in provisioning the army, but the connection is real and lasting. When we say someone is worth their salt, we are reaching back through this 20 centuries of language to a world in which this mineral was woven into the very concept of what work was worth. But Rome's relationship with salt was not merely about internal supply. As Rome expanded, first across Italy, then into North Africa, Gaul, Iberia, and the Middle East, it absorbed salt-producing regions with the same deliberate strategic logic it applied to grain lands and mineral deposits. The salt marshes of North Africa, the Sicilian salt pans, the coastal evaporation beds of the Iberian Peninsula, all were brought under Roman administration, tahals, and managed as strategic resources. The Roman salt supply network was, in miniature, a model of the same imperial logic that drove all Roman expansion. Find the things people cannot live without, control their production, and you control the people. If Rome's salt story is about infrastructure and empire, the story of West Africa's salt trade is about something even more astonishing. A world in which salt, in certain markets and at certain moments, commanded prices that made it genuinely comparable in value to the gold that surrounded it. The Trans-Saharan trade route, one of the great commercial networks of the medieval world, operated on a spectacular geographic asymmetry. South of the Sahara, in the savanna and forest zones of West Africa, there was gold. More gold than anywhere else in the medieval world. The gold fields of Bambouk and Bour, and later Akan, produced wealth that made the Mali Empire and its successor states among the richest political entities on earth. At its height, the Mali Empire's ruler, Mansa Musa, was estimated by historians to be among the wealthiest individuals in all of recorded human history. When he made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he traveled with a retinue reportedly numbering 60,000 people, and gave away so much gold along the route that he single-handedly crashed the price of gold in Egypt for more than a decade. But for all that gold, the interior of West Africa had almost no salt. The forest and savanna soils are salt-poor. The nearest major salt deposits lay hundreds of miles to the north, in the heart of the Sahara itself, at Taghaza, a settlement so remote and inhospitable that the Arab historian Ibn Battuta, who visited in the 14th century, described it as a place where even the houses were built of salt blocks because there was nothing else to build with. The workers who mined there, trapped in one of the most brutal environments on earth, were paid in millet brought from the south, grain traded for the privilege of extracting minerals in a place where nothing grew and nothing lived except the salt and the men condemned to mine it. Picture for a moment what that journey actually meant for the men who made it. A caravan trader leaving Timbuktu northward into the Sahara would have known, before he set out, that the road ahead held 500 miles of some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, temperatures exceeding 50 degrees in daylight, nights that dropped to near freezing, wells separated by days of travel, their water brackish and warm. The camels, loaded with slabs of salt weighing up to 90 kilograms each, had to be fed and watered at intervals that did not always match the geography. Men died on this road, regularly. Their bones were found by the next caravan. And yet the caravans kept coming, season after season, century after century, because the mathematics of the exchange waiting at the end of the road made the risk worth taking. That is how valuable salt was. It made crossing the Sahara a rational business decision. The caravans that crossed that desert were carrying these two substances in opposite directions simultaneously, gold moving north, salt moving south. And at the point of exchange in the great market cities of Timbuktu and Jenne and Walata, the two traded at roughly equivalent value. In some West African markets, salt and gold were reported to trade at comparable values, though the exact ratio shifted by place, by season, and by how desperate the need on either side happened to be. What is certain is that salt commanded a price extraordinary enough to sustain one of the most punishing trade routes on Earth, across one of the most lethal landscapes human beings have ever chosen to cross for profit. This was not irrationality. This was a precise reflection of supply and demand across one of the most challenging geographic barriers on Earth. The people of the Sahel had gold they could not eat. They needed salt to preserve food, to flavor grain, to survive. To them, the salt was worth what they would pay for it, which was everything they had that the desert merchants wanted. The Mali Empire understood this calculus perfectly. Its kings taxed the salt trade as it passed through their territory, taking a cut of every slab that moved south and every measure of gold that moved north. This tax revenue, as reliable and enormous as the trade itself, was one of the primary financial foundations of one of the greatest empires of the medieval world. Salt did not merely trade alongside gold in West Africa. Salt was the mechanism by which gold became power. China invented the salt monopoly, not as a side note, as a deliberate, sophisticated instrument of state power that would be imitated in various forms by every major government that came after it. By the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, the Chinese state had already spent centuries experimenting with how to extract maximum revenue from salt production without destroying the industry that generated it. The solution Emperor Wu Di implemented in 119 BC was elegant in its ruthlessness. The state would not produce salt itself, but it would control the right to sell it. Private producers could continue mining and evaporating, but they had to sell to government merchants at government prices, who then sold to the public at a significant markup. The difference was pure state revenue. The debate this policy generated was remarkable enough that it was preserved in one of the most extraordinary documents in Chinese administrative history, the Yanti Lun, or Discourses on Salt and Iron, a record of the actual arguments made in 81 BC between Confucian scholars who opposed the monopoly on moral grounds and government officials who defended it on fiscal ones. The scholars argued that state control of salt degraded its quality, exploited the poor, and corrupted the moral basis of governance. The officials argued, with equal precision, that without salt revenues, the state could not defend its borders, build its infrastructure, or maintain the apparatus on which civilization depended. These are not ancient arguments. They are the same arguments about the relationship between taxation and justice, between state power and individual liberty, that governments and philosophers debate today. And the fact that they were being made with full sophistication about salt, the most basic of human necessities, tells you everything about what salt meant to the societies that controlled it. China's salt monopoly in various forms survived for over 2,000 years. It was still operating when the last Qing emperor abdicated in 1912. For 20 centuries, the revenue it generated, enormous, reliable, extracted from a substance no one could live without, funded Chinese civilization in ways that historians are only beginning to fully quantify. Salt, taxes, and revolutions. The most hated tax in French history was not on wine. It was not on land. It was not on trade. It was on salt. And it was hated so completely, so deeply and personally by the people who lived under it, that its abolition was one of the first demands of the French Revolution. Demanded before the Declaration of the Rights of Man, before the abolition of feudal privilege, before almost anything else. The gabelle, France's salt tax, had its origins in the 14th century, and by the time of Louis XVI had evolved into one of the most grotesquely inequitable fiscal systems imaginable. Different regions of France paid radically different prices for salt, not because the salt was different, but because the tax was different. Some provinces paid 20 times more than others for the same mineral. Every household in the high-tax regions was legally required to purchase a minimum annual quantity of salt, the sel du devoir, whether they needed it or not. This enforced purchase could not be avoided, could not be reduced, and had to be bought from the state's designated salt warehouses. The greniers à sel at the state's price. To understand what this meant at the level of a single family, imagine a peasant household in Brittany in the 1770s, a province in the high tax zone of the Gabelle. The father works land he does not own. The mother preserves whatever food can be preserved against the winter. They have children. They need salt to cure meat, to keep vegetables from rotting, to season the grain-based porridge that is most of what they eat. But the legal price of salt in their province, inflated by the Gabelle, takes a portion of their income they can barely afford. And a few miles away, just across the provincial border, the same salt is available at a fraction of the cost, because in that province the tax happens to be lower. The salt is identical. The injustice is complete. And the temptation to cross that border, to buy what your family needs at a price you can afford, is not a criminal impulse. It is the arithmetic of survival. Smuggling salt, carrying it across provincial boundaries to sell in high-tax areas at below-market prices, was a crime punishable by the galleys, by branding, by imprisonment, and in serious cases by death. An estimated 3,000 people per year were imprisoned in pre-revolutionary France for salt smuggling. Many of them were children, sent by desperate families who calculated that a child might attract less suspicion from the Gabelle inspectors than an adult. The faussonniers, the false salt sellers, were a class of criminal created entirely by the state's insistence on maintaining a monopoly over a biological necessity. Is it any wonder that when the revolution came, when the people of France finally rose against a system they experienced as arbitrary, cruel, and fundamentally unjust, salt was among the first things they demanded back? The Gabelle was abolished by the National Assembly in 1790, to scenes of popular celebration that contemporary accounts describe as extraordinary, as though a weight that had pressed on the French body politic for 4 centuries had suddenly been lifted. But the story of salt taxation does not end with France. It merely migrates to one of the most remarkable acts of political theater in the 20th century. On the 12th of March 1930, Mohandas Gandhi began walking from his ashram at Sabarmati toward the coastal village of Dandi, 240 miles away. He was 60 years old. He walked 24 days through the heat of the Indian plains, and when he arrived at the shore of the Arabian Sea on April 6th, he bent down, picked up a handful of mud and salt from the beach, and in that single gesture, that deliberate, quiet, unhurried act, he broke the law of the British Empire. The British had imposed a salt tax on India that bore a disturbing resemblance to France's old Gabelle. Indians were forbidden from producing their own salt, from collecting it from the sea that lapped at their own shores, from selling it without paying duty to the colonial power that controlled the salt trade. Salt was taxed at a rate that represented a deeply disproportionate burden on the poorest Indians, the agricultural laborers, the subsistence farmers, the families who needed salt to preserve food and to survive the physical labor of working under the Indian sun. The salt tax was not, in purely monetary terms, enormous, but in symbolic terms it was perfectly chosen. Gandhi understood something about salt that made it the ideal instrument for a campaign of civil disobedience against empire. Salt was not a luxury, it was not a habit, it was not an indulgence, it was a biological necessity that God, or nature, had placed in the sea in abundance, available to anyone who approached the shore. To tax it was to place a toll on survival itself. To criminalize its free collection was to assert that the colonial power owned not merely Indian land and Indian labor, but the very minerals necessary for Indian life. When Gandhi reached the sea and picked up that salt, the Indian National Congress had already telegraphed the act to newspapers across the world. The images, this slight elderly man in white, bending to the earth in defiance of empire, traveled around the globe within days. 80,000 Indians were arrested in the months that followed as the civil disobedience campaign spread. The British response, arresting people for picking up salt from a beach, made the injustice of colonial rule visible to the international community in a way that years of political argument had not. The Salt March did not immediately end British rule, but it broke something in the moral authority of the Raj that would never be repaired. India gained independence 17 years later, and the Salt March became one of the defining examples of how an act of profound simplicity, a man bending to pick up what the earth freely offered, could shake an empire. The modern legacy of salt. Here is a fact that might surprise you. Of all the salt produced in the world today, Estimates suggest less than 10% goes into food, and in many of the world's largest producing nations, the figure is considerably lower. The mineral that built civilizations, that funded empires, that sparked revolutions, that people died for and governments controlled with military force, 95% of modern salt production goes not into food but into industrial processes. Chlorine production, caustic soda manufacturing, the plastics industry, de-icing roads in winter. The United States alone uses approximately 8 million tons of road salt per year, more than the entire ancient world could have imagined existing. Water softening, textile dyeing, paper production, the pharmaceutical industry, oil drilling. The chlor-alkali process, the industrial separation of salt into its component elements, sodium and chlorine, is the foundation of modern chemical manufacturing in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. Chlorine, derived from salt, gives us PVC plastic, which is in the pipes under your feet and the window frames around you. It gives us the disinfectants that make municipal water supplies safe to drink. It gives us pharmaceutical intermediates without which modern medicine would be unrecognizable. The sodium gives us sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, without which paper, textiles, aluminum, and dozens of other industries could not function. We no longer go to war over salt. We no longer pay a gabelle or queue at a grenier. Salt is so cheap today, produced in such vast quantities that it costs less per kilogram than almost any other commodity on Earth, that it is almost invisible. We reach for it without thinking, season our food without gratitude, and discard what spills without a second thought. But consider what that invisibility conceals. Every preserved food you have ever eaten owes its existence to the same properties of salt that ancient Egyptians used to mummify their dead and salt their fish. Every winter road you have ever driven safely on was made navigable by the same mineral Roman soldiers were paid in. Every plastic pipe in your home, every chlorinated sip of drinking water, every paper this documentary's research was printed on, all of it traces back, through chains of industrial chemistry, to that white crystal that a human hand lifted from a rock by the sea and touched to a tongue, and recognized, in some wordless animal understanding, as necessary. The world has not moved beyond salt. It has simply learned to take it for granted. There is something humbling about following the history of salt, not because it diminishes human greatness, the empires, the trade routes, the philosophical debates, the acts of resistance, but because it grounds all of that greatness in something so small, so simple, so utterly without pretension. Gold is beautiful, gold is rare. Gold catches light and holds it, and humans have always understood, instinctively, that something so visually extraordinary must be valuable. The desire for gold makes a kind of psychological sense. Salt does not shimmer. Salt does not catch light except in the most modest way. Salt dissolves the moment it touches moisture. It is, by every aesthetic measure, one of the least impressive substances on Earth. And yet, about the fish that fed the Egyptian armies that built one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Salt funded the Mali Empire's extraordinary golden age through the mathematics of a desert trade that made a handful of crystals worth a handful of coins. Salt paid the Roman soldiers who built the roads that still underlie European civilization. Salt provoked the revolution that produced the first modern declaration of human rights. Salt was the object of that quiet, extraordinary act of defiance on an Indian beach that showed the world what moral courage could accomplish with nothing more than bent knees and an open hand. What is the lesson in all of this? Perhaps it is about the nature of value, that the things we take for granted are often the things on which everything else depends. That the substances so common we ignore them are often the ones that, examined carefully, turn out to have made our entire world possible. That the history of civilization is not only the history of kings and conquests and great ideas, but the history of the minerals in the ground and the human beings desperate enough and clever enough, and sometimes cruel enough to build entire systems of power around controlling access to them. And perhaps there is something worth carrying forward in the memory of those millions of people, the Fauconiers of France, the Indian farmers arrested on a beach, the miners of Tagaza who built their houses from the mineral they were condemned to extract, who understood in their bones, in a way comfortable modern people rarely need to, exactly what it costs when the things you cannot live without are held in someone else's hands. Gold made people rich. Salt kept them alive, and for most of human history, survival was worth far more than treasure. Today, salt is so cheap that we spill it without noticing. We shake it from plastic containers without gratitude, sweep it from countertops without thought, and buy a kilogram of it for less than the cost of a minute's worth of electricity. The thing that funded Mali's golden age, that built Rome's roads, that sent men across the Sahara, that children were arrested for smuggling, that Gandhi bent to the earth to reclaim. We have made it so abundant and so ordinary that it has almost disappeared from our awareness entirely. But the world we inherited, its cities, its trade routes, its revolutions, its empires, its languages, even the word we use for the money in our pockets, was built grain by grain on salt. The next time you reach for it without thinking, consider what that thoughtlessness cost, and what it means that we live in a world where the price of survival has finally, mercifully fallen low enough that most of us never have to think about it at all.